Hello, everyone. I am Beth Lown, Chief Medical Officer here at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining our webinar. I'm going to let people kind of settle in, and we see some of our numbers going up. There are many, many people from across the world who've registered for this webinar, and we're grateful to all of you and just so happy to welcome you. I'm going to just start by reminding everybody that this is the Schwartz Center's Compassion Action webinar, Grief, Loss, and Mourning in the Time of COVID, and thank you again for joining us. So we are, for many of you who aren't as familiar with the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, we're a nonprofit based in Boston, founded in 1995. Many of you may be familiar with our signature program, the Schwartz Rounds. It's offered to hundreds of our member organizations and systems around the world. And it provides caregivers from across healthcare professions and roles a forum to get together and discuss the complex emotional experiences of caregiving, which is just what we're going to do today. Before we get started, a few things about today's session to be aware of. This special series of COVID-19 focused compassion action webinars is supported by the Coveras Community Healthcare Foundation and Ellen and Michael Gordon. We're so grateful for their support in making this possible. Today's program will last 60 minutes. There'll be a panel discussion for the first 45 or so, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So please do feel free to go ahead and enter your questions in the chat or the Q&A pane following throughout the discussion. And we're also recording this session. It's going to be posted on our website by tomorrow for future viewing. This topic of grief, loss, and mourning in the time of COVID, of course, is on everyone's mind, and it's inescapable. It's such a challenging time. And it's also a time to celebrate what we do, what we've all been called to do. It's a chance to celebrate lives here, lives lost, and how we really think about mourning and loss in this very, very unique and challenging time. I'm looking forward to your discussion today. So we're going to turn to our panelists for a few words of wisdom and insight about how to understand what we're seeing, what we're feeling, and how to move forward. So let me introduce them in alphabetical order. First is Dr. Rana Awdish, critical care physician at Henry Ford Hospital, where she's the director of the pulmonary hypertension program and medical director of care experience for the Henry Ford Health System, and an associate professor at Wayne State University School of Medicine. She's also the author of In Shock, a memoir about her own illness experience and how it shaped her practice as a clinician. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's just very powerful. It's an astonishing work, really. And thank you for writing it, Rana. We're thrilled to see you, of course, as always. Dr. Candi K is an associate professor at Baylor, and as a thanatologist, her research focuses on diversity in death, examining the whitening of the funeral industry and death studies, and arguing that the field of death and grief has been heavily influenced by white and Protestant worldviews. And when she's not examining issues like these, she focuses on living well and is an avid reader, sometimes a surfer, sometimes a coffee drinker. Welcome, Candi.
Thank you.
And we have Koshin Paley Ellison, author, Zen teacher, Jungian psychotherapist, certified chaplaincy educator. After many years as chaplain and psychotherapist, Koshin co-founded the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, which offers contemplative approaches to care through education, personal caregiving, and Zen practice. And Koshin's work has been widely published. He's the author of Wholehearted, Slow Down, Help Out, Wake Up, and is co-editor of Awake at the Bedside, Contemplative Teachings on Palliative and End-of-Life Care. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
And of course, last but not least, our moderator, Michael Hebb, partner at Round Glass and the founder of EOL and deathOverDinner.org, author of Let's Talk About Death, and before COVID could be found traveling the world, speaking at TED Med, the Obama Foundation Summit, South by Southwest, the World Economic Forum, and elsewhere. His writing has appeared in various publications, including USA Today, GQ Food and Wine. So thank you all for being here with us. And I am going to hand this over to you, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Beth. What an honor to be here back at the Schwartz Center. I would love to hear from the folks that are joining us in chat. And since we're entering the season of gratitude, would love to know where you're coming in from, if you're with an institution or an organization that you want to mention, and then tell us something that you're grateful for. It would be really nice to see the chat filled with that. And also think about questions that you have for these extraordinary friends of mine. And that's something that I'm going to start by saying that I'm grateful for. And that's the three of you and Beth and the Schwartz Center. Really extraordinary friends I have. And you know, they like to say that the quality of our life is reflected in the quality of our community, and pretty much means I have the best life ever. So thank you for joining. And we're encroaching upon another famous Schwartz milestone, and another Boston milestone, actually. Maurice Schwartz is, it's 25 years after the death of Maurice Schwartz. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Maurice Schwartz, he was a professor at Brandeis, and he was made famous by his Nightline interview with Ted Koppel. And that interview, which almost didn't happen, Ted Koppel, I was just talking to Richard Harris, the producer, just minutes ago. They're doing a piece on NPR about the 25th anniversary of Maurice's death. Ted Koppel and Richard had come across a headline that a professor was giving his final lectures from his deathbed. And that's what Maurice did. He brought his students in to teach his final classes in his house as he was dying from terminal cancer. And Ted said, I want to go and interview him. And his producers at Nightline said, there's no way. No one wants to hear about it. No one wants to talk about end of life, death, terminal illness, especially at prime time. And Ted went and did it anyway. And it became the most viewed interview of Ted Koppel's very illustrious career. And it also inspired one of Maurice's old students, Mitch Albom, who happened to see that piece, to go and spend some time with his professor. And that's where Tuesdays with Maury came from. It wasn't intended to be a book, and it almost didn't get published, was turned down so many times, and then it became the most printed biography of all time. So I was just talking to Richard about how much has improved in the last 25 years, and the fact that we're having this conversation with medical leaders, end-of-life leaders, chaplains, all together is just a sign of how far we've come. What I wanted to share first before we get into the first question was this incredible essay that I just got and started reading that Rana wrote. And I wanted to just, if it's okay, read a few lines from it before our first question. And this is an essay called The Shape of the Shore. It's gonna be very short. Sometimes chaos in the worst of time. Oops, that's actually, those are my notes. And now to The Shape of the Shore. This is just an excerpt. The psychologist made more formal ceremonial suggestions. We could create a kind of meaningful ritual around the donning of our protective equipment, they explained. You could attempt to acknowledge the sacredness of the act of applying protection to your bodies. Take a moment to try and envision an invisible cloak of bright white light enveloping you in safety. Picture carrying that safe, comforting blanket of protection with you into the rooms. We stared back blankly, seeing only the desperate thrashing patients on the other side of the glass, wondering if we were the only ones who could see them. At a time when no one could ensure our safety, We could color and pretend, or we could choose to care for our patients. We would learn to live with airlessness. We would learn to do the work while holding our breath. Incredibly powerful piece. We'll share it again with everyone. It's in the chat. But what I wanted to focus on today is really inspired by one of my favorite books, A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit. And the first question is, in this time of so much suffering and so much chaos, where we are certainly just surviving, are we evolving at the same time? And, you know, specifically to Candi and Koshin, what are we learning about the importance of ritual? And to all three of you, what are we learning, or perhaps even relearning, about compassionate care? And this is going to be an organic conversation. We'll just see who goes first, and then we'll let it roll.
Well, I can jump in here. I was thinking about the kind of daily rituals of our lives. So Confucius said that anything could become a ritual, and I really agree. And this could be anything from brushing your teeth to your morning commute, to even sports, right? So the ritual of making Thanksgiving dinner and not eating lunch because you really want to be hungry and stuff yourself, and then you watch a football game. And so these are the kinds of things that I think have been upended. And I mention this because I think it's these small rituals that we don't think about that really shape the way our lives look and feel. So I really think that one of the things I'm seeing in the pandemic is people thrown off course by the lack of these small rituals. I know Sarah May from Kailua said that she's thankful for coffee. And, you know, we're missing going to the coffee shop and just working with strangers, but in a community that centers around, you know, drinking this beverage and kind of taking a moment from our day. So I really do think that this is an opportunity, but I also think it's a really important moment to think about how important rituals are, and how from the smallest ritual that we might have complained about, like our morning commute and traffic, to the big rituals like mourning the losses of those who have died in our lives and not being able to gather in a funeral.
Thank you, Candi. Jump in.
Well, we're talking about evolving. We're always evolving. You know, we meant that like what we're evolving into, but there's always change. It's been one of incredible heartbreak, and just I feel like what's being asked of us is just to keep almost like bearing, you know, as a friend of mine says, you know, bearing the unbearable. It just, it's like what we think we can't bear, the rituals that we've been able to, holding up an iPad, you know, and so someone could mouth, you know, like the person who was dying couldn't speak anymore, but they could, you know, and just like press their hands against the screen. And the ritual of that, and the ritual of, you know, thinking about this one family who lost their baby during the beginning of the pandemic, and they said, we must come to the temple. We must. And they said, we will get hazmat suits. We just have to be in the physical space. And so we really kind of went for it, and really with a super like PPE and brought people together in this very and powerful, in the midst of the pandemic in New York City, where, you know, the streets were really abandoned, and this couple were able to come in, and we could ring bells and to offer incense and to say, this baby died, this happened, and we have ceremony. And to me, the importance of that, and for them to scream and for them to have the space to do that, and for us to be creative and loving and just heartbroken. I feel like in many ways, I think the way we're, at least what I'm experiencing in myself and in our community selves, to keep feeling it. I'm just thinking about the tens of thousands of people who have died just in the last 24 hours in Nicaragua, and in the hurricane. It's just like it's just like
Yeah.
So
I would add
to Phil,
to what Koshin has said. So much of what we're learning to attend to, I feel like, is what's not visible. There's so much separation, and creating a sense of community despite that has really re-taught me how interdependent we all are. And I've seen that in the things that we're not willing to give up. I have a friend who's a nurse whose sister was dying in hospice, and because she was a nurse in a COVID ICU, she couldn't go into the hospice, but she would go and literally cling to the outside of the window in the hopes that her sister would sense her presence. Her need to be present for her sister's death was so strong. She stayed there for 9 hours, just hoping to be felt. And the power of that in this moment, our willingness to kind of be creative, to demonstrate our love, and our renewed understanding, I think, that individual health means nothing in the context of a community that is unwell or doesn't have the resources that it needs. We had a patient early in the pandemic when we were getting nervous about resources becoming scarce, who came in respiratory distress, and we had to have a conversation about him needing to be placed on a ventilator. And he very clearly was able to say to us, "You do not give me that machine if there is someone who needs it more than me. I have lived my life. I have made my peace. If someone needs it more, they need it." And that kind of self-sacrifice that we saw, was modeled in so many ways, but I think has been blunted by some self-sacrificial behavior that maybe we've seen as well. And learning to attend to what's less visible, I think, has helped.
Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation I just had this morning with Dr. BJ Miller and Elua Arthur, two incredible other leaders in the end-of-life space. And we were talking about how much they rely on touch as healers, as guides, and how to rely. What have they replaced? What has been the proxy for touch? What has been the proxy for that kind of presence? And BJ was talking about how to compassionately use silence in conversations with people on Zoom, and how to allow to be present for people, to allow emotions to arrive and to be spoken that you wouldn't necessarily create time for, which was to me such a fascinating, use of the technology. And Koshin, you talk about warming up the screen, and how to increase empathy and compassion. What are some of the ways that you've increased connection? What are some of the tools, whether that's warming up the screen? And Koshin, I'd love to hear you give that distinction. And then when it comes to Candi, like, what are some of the suggestions you're giving people when they can't be at funerals or they can't grieve together? So if we can maybe start with Koshin on warming up the screen. And Koshin, I'm going to raise my hand at you if it's breaking up a little bit, just so on your first part. So I'll just raise my hand, and so we can pause and make sure that your bandwidth comes back. How's that? Great.
Sounds good. So yeah, so a big part of, since the beginning of this time, you know, Chota and myself, when at the Zen Center, we were really clear in the beginning of the end of February, beginning of March, that we needed to fully, our practice for all of these years has almost like prepared us in many ways to this moment to really bring presence. And so many people were talking about in the beginning, like, oh, the screen, it's so cold, I'm zoomed out, I'm this, I'm that. And what I find is like, wow, it's actually kind of amazing if you really just like really lean in and to really get curious and warm the glass on your screen. And so with your attention, your care, and that bridge of compassion to like actually be curious about like Rana's couch and what are all those angles behind Candi, and what are those paintings behind Michael? Are they photographs? We don't know, but you know, just to like really leaning in and without being kind of like, you know, but to really be curious about what is actually happening, and this opportunity to pay exquisite and tender attention is amazing. I mean, I feel that we can do something very unique now. And we've been training, you know, caregivers around the country to actually learning how do you actually pay attention? This is something that we've been doing even before COVID, because we don't really often learn how to pay attention in relationship. And actually now people are in Zoom meetings and they're like this, doing something else. And that actually impacts how.
We lost you for just a sec. Say the last two sentences, because I know that they were great.
We deserve the nourishment of knowing and the experience of actually caring for other people and allowing them to feel cared for, that giving and receiving, that kind of generosity, like you were asking us to call out in the beginning, is, to me, actually giving our full attention and receiving someone's full attention is the healing agent. Kind of like what you were talking about with BJ and Lewis, that we can offer always.
Yeah, that's an amazing distinction to make, because we aren't called to action in the same way when we're not in people's presence. And so a part of ourselves kind of goes dormant. That generosity to take care of, that, you know, that's innate in all animals, right? Like, we want to physically, emotionally want to take care of. And for many of us, it's so hard that we just kind of turn that dial down, but it does, the nourishment of that. Thank you for calling that out, Koshin. It's really, really important. Brenda, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Michael, I love this emphasis on silence. It makes me think of the pause, of course, that, you know, healthcare practitioners talk about. But I always try to point out to people that music is framed by the musical rests, that sentences and words are shaped by the punctuation that calls for pauses. I mean, it's truly the silence that gives the rest of it meaning and shape and beauty. So I really do embrace this call to silence and listening, the attention that Koshin's talking about. I mean, I really think, I think part of what's so hard about the pandemic is that we're uncomfortable. We want to fix it and we can't fix it. And we have to instead witness suffering. And that's a really difficult thing to do, to witness suffering. But that's what we are doing. And that's what all these amazing healthcare practitioners, mental health counselors, that's what everyone is being called to do. And that also is really important and valuable work. Rana, did you see this great quote here? Someone loves your book.
It's very kind. Thank you, friend. Both of your comments brought up for me the sort of leap I had to make as a physician, where for the longest time I thought that my job was to just shorten the space of suffering from illness to health. And if I could foreshorten it, I didn't have to spend time sinking into it and witnessing it and being present for it. And that was hard. And, you know, when I was ill myself, I began to really see that if I didn't feel that someone was witnessing it with me, then I couldn't feel seen. I couldn't be held in personhood. I couldn't be healed. And I've had to really change my understanding of my value in my patient's life. And to what you said, you know, I believe close observation is a form of devotion. And when we're devoted to people, that energy is healing. And finding ways to do that despite the confines of our current state is what we're called to do.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind for me is surrender, right? I mean, witness, what I'm just hearing is the idea of a clinician bearing witness, which isn't necessarily something that we immediately think. We do think about a clinician fixing, like Candi said. But this notion of surrendering to something larger than us and witnessing and being with is maybe a very, very powerful lesson to be taught across, you know, this whole clinical continuum. Koshin, you might have some thoughts on bearing witness and surrendering.
Two of my favorite things. And yeah, bearing witness to me is actually what is always true, I think, is actually learning how to bear, like in the Zen tradition, where there's a bodhisattva or this awakening quality that we all have called Avalokiteshvara. And she has 1,000 hands and 1,000 eyes. And it's just basically the image her name means.
No, yeah, we lost you a little bit.
The one who hears all the cries of the world. Yeah. And so I think that in some ways that's what we bear. We bear like what I was talking about earlier. It's like hearing the cries from Nicaragua, hearing the cries from ICUs, hearing the cries from the 17,000 older adults living in Chelsea, one neighborhood in Manhattan, who are alone, living alone, and in the midst of COVID, who are terrified to leave their apartments. So learning how that, and then what we need to do is first bear that, and then learning how to, the loving action in many ways is just saying that I can be there and I can show up and let me give you a call. I think that very often we want to, like we were talking about fixing, and we've been talking about pausing. So how do we pause and say, what is actually needed here? And I know in my experience as a clinician, what's really often needed is how you look at someone, or how if you're speaking a lot of the, even just on the phone. On the phone?
We got you now, yeah. You're back. It was just a little bit of you know.
It's just cutting out like the most important parts of wisdom you have to impart on us, Koshin.
There's a lesson there.
Well, I don't have much. I don't have much to offer, but just my experience. But but I think it's just about how we listen, you know. And to me, that's the love, you know, and jump in. So I think I'll leave that there.
Okay, cool. Stephanie had a suggestion that maybe, I don't want to lose your beautiful face, but it might help if your video's off, just so, because I know that people are having to surrender to not getting every last bit of your word. Candi, I see you nodding furiously with what Koshin was saying. And I would love for you to reflect a little bit on how ritual does have us surrender to something as well. I mean, it seems like it's one of the core lessons in ritual, something larger than us, how we can gain nourishment from that. Some thoughts there?
Well, I'm going to go off your last part on nourishment, because I really love the ways that we can use food and food practices. And it's particularly fitting because Thanksgiving is coming up, whether you celebrate this colonialist artifact or not. But I really think that there's a lot of wonderful food rituals that we can incorporate into our lives, from something simple as baking grandma's cookies and grandma's no longer around with our child, and as a time to kind of share stories about grandma, from gathering the family around the table to being able to eat favorite meals and leaving a place for someone who's no longer present. Or even if I know when my sister had COVID, my stepmom was absolutely frantic and it was very difficult for her. So she and I shared dinner together during that time because it made it a lot easier for us to be virtually present, just sharing a meal from a distance. And so there are really wonderful ways that we can still be together with technology, and even with things as low tech as simply cooking a recipe. So yeah, absolutely. For those of you who don't know, Michael Hebb started Death Over Dinner, and it's one of my very favorite things in the world, basically because it's a time to reflect, and these simple rituals of just eating and sharing a meal, whether virtually or in person, they're wonderful ways to grieve together, to share together, to bring in those who are no longer with us.
Yeah. I mean, I would love for you to, comment on what has been said, but also I kind of like piling up the questions a little bit, but I'm curious if, since we have probably a lot of clinicians on the call, and you've been in the thick of it in Detroit at the Henry Ford, I'm curious about you run a care team. Like, what are some of the dynamic changes, innovations, social, emotional, psycho-emotional, shifts that your team has had to make that may just be for this period of time, but may have a lasting effect as well?
Yeah, it's the pace of innovation during this time has just accelerated in incredible ways, and the resources that have had to sort of come to the bedside just to provide some foundation of support. It's been really remarkable. The places where I've seen the most impact, truly, our director of physician wellness, Lisa McLean, developed a paradigm where we were really providing peer support to each other. So clinical leads would be paired with a clinical psychologist, and their group would come together in a longitudinal way. And in those first meetings, it was really just sharing of experiences and, holding space for that. But what came over time, and this is, something that was tremendously healing, was our ability to reflect our values that we couldn't even see in ourselves in those moments back to each other. So we were feeling, the tremendous burden of being the only one present at a time of intensity, and wishing the family could be present, and having to really play surrogate to that, and seeing these end-of-life conversations. And it was feeling very heavy, but to have somebody be able to frame it in terms of our attributes, the values that we brought to that moment, that in what would have been a void, we filled it with our presence, allowed us to move towards post-traumatic growth, I think, instead of post-traumatic stress, which is where we would have headed. So having vulnerability, sharing what's difficult, hearing it echoed in your team, and supporting each other through really sense-making, creation of identity. I don't think we always think about identity formation as a social endeavor, that we do it for each other. We do it for our patients. We hold them in personhood. We do it for our teams. We show them who they are. But that's been probably the most healing aspect of this.
Yeah. And do you feel like that will continue?
I do. I think the bonds that have developed have deepened. I think, as with anything, when you have vulnerability and you go through something difficult together, you're more willing to go there and have harder conversations. I don't know anyone that has superficial conversations in the hospital these days. It's, you know, it's very supportive.
Yeah. We're just going to remind people that they can start to pose questions in the Q&A. I want to change directions just slightly toward grief. And Koshin, I think, is back with us. I would love to hear, you've been working with an incredible community through the New York Zen Center, and curious what you have found in these times to be some of the most impactful practices for you yourself, but also for people in your community as they're dealing with grief. And I mean, I think there's acute grief, but there's also just anticipatory grief and this massive grief of those millions of voices. So any thoughts there and guidances and takeaways for people, I think would be really powerful. You might be on mute. Okay, we might not have Koshin. Candi, let's talk about grief.
Yeah, so I wanted to address some of the questions we've gotten about particular rituals and resources. So we've been asked to give them some practical resources. So I did want to mention COVID paper, which was created, I don't know, was that the beginning of the summer? Over 80 specialists came together, and all people who are funeral directors, palliative caregivers, death doulas, all kinds of deaf people and doctors, etc. And they put together this wonderful resource on death, dying, and grief in COVID. So I do want to point some of you to that. And a couple of you have asked about specific rituals. So there are a lot that you can do. There are some great, if you go to COVID paper, there's some fantastic apps that are out now using your phone. And there are some really good internet resources. But again, I want to point to low-tech things that you can also do. You can simply write a letter to the person that you're grieving. You can then ask your family to come together. You all can go in the backyard and you can burn the letters and say something for the deceased. You can have a meal. You can leave a space for them at the table. My kiddo a couple of years ago gave me the best Mother's Day present ever. She wrote all the things she liked about me on little scraps of paper. Yeah, I still have it. It's like a great ego booster. But you could do something similar for someone who has died, and have everyone in the family write these scraps of paper, something that you sincerely love about them, even before they have died, if they're in the dying process. There's some fantastic, very low-key, low-tech, amazing rituals that you can do. You can light a candle for them every day. I have friends that have had drive-by funeral processions, and usually they've driven by the family of the deceased because they just want to show them how much they care. So there's a lot of things that we can still do, even if we can't physically touch each other or hug each other. we can still be present for each other with our hearts and our spirit. So I really think that there are a lot of resources available.
And I think one thing that I was impacted by when we did the work together with the COVID paper was this notion that having a funeral or memorial doesn't necessarily need to exist within a certain time period. That we can absolutely have memorials or even funerals for people that we've lost during this period of time when we can't be in each other's presence. And the emotional impact of that might even be more powerful when we're not so overwhelmed. And so that's just something to offer to people is the kind of rain check.
There was a beautiful, I don't know if anyone came across it, but there was a beautiful art installation that was placed on Belle Isle in Detroit, which is our Central Park, designed by the same landscape architect as the New York Central Park, where large photographs of all the community members who were lost were displayed along what was essentially a bike path. And it was this beautiful outdoor space that we, even healthcare workers, could go to and see our patients and really mourn them as people and our friends in some cases. It's another instance where I think we've all learned or relearned that in very difficult times, we rely on art in different ways to help us heal.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful example. We had Koshin and then he's gone. There's a follow-up question for you, Rana. Can you talk more about the post-traumatic growth that you mentioned? For those of us who are perhaps the sole spiritual caregiver in places like nursing homes where families and outside ministers have not been able to come in. I don't know your thoughts on that.
I can certainly speak to it from the position of experiencing these sessions. I think for us as caregivers, holding on to our own stories and bearing the weight of them alone is very hard. And finding a community with which we can share those stories can be so healing. And that community can take many different shapes. For us, sitting in a room together and being able to hold each other up and just note the qualities we saw in each other. And this is something I think we can do for ourselves, to say, I really noticed that I had persistence in this situation. I noticed this thing in myself that I've been working towards. It isn't often that we give ourselves that grace. I think it's very often that we feel the stress of these situations, but to just shift our frame slightly into what attributes we brought into the moment that we're healing for the person, even our presence, can really move you towards growth.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important. Koshin is maybe back. Houston, do we have you? Are you there?
He's so elusive.
I know. Just drops these.
I'm here.
Yay.
From the muck of Munich, down comes the lotus. Did you hear my earlier question about grief? Or would you like me to rephrase?
I would love a rephrasing.
Terrific. I was just noting that you're a caretaker of a large community that has seen a lot of loss. And I'm curious, and also just is grieving in general, like we all are, and you yourself personally. What have been some of the practices or just perspectives that you think have been most helpful around grief in these times when we are locked down?
I think to realize and just to be able to say we are all grieving and we are all sad and heartbroken and don't know how to hold it, and none of us know how to do it. To say that, to have the courage in a way, just to say what is most obvious in a way, and we actually have a ritual of chanting what's called the Heart Sutra every day. And in the dedication, we talk about, though we're dedicating this chanting and our meditation practice to those who wish that they could be with their loved ones, who can't see their loved ones, to those who are afraid and feeling afraid. And so just to kind of name, I feel like one of the rituals that's been really healing for our community is saying those things, as well as, we remember those who have died and those who are sick every day, and we say their names. And so every day we have meditation practice and we say the names. And I think that there's something so important to kind of go back to that family that came to the loss of their baby, like that they actually hadn't named their baby. And so they named their baby. There's something about the naming and how healing it can be and how excruciating it is to name it and to call it out and to say, yes, we are heartbroken and we're together. Yes, we're grieving and we're together. It's like the generosity of showing up with your whole body and mind in a way that you might not expect. And without any kind of answers, because I don't know what the answer is, other than kind of in the Hebrew, they say, Hineni, I am here.
Candi, there's a question in the Q&A that maybe you have some thoughts on. And maybe there's some historical examples to pull from, but of massive grieving, or what are your thoughts on our national and thus far disenfranchised and unmemorialized grief?
So I think this is a really tough part, right? Because we have a lot of different realities that we're dealing with, unfortunately. And so at this point, we don't have a message that is unified, and therefore our grief is and will remain disenfranchised as a collective until we do have that kind of message. So I don't think there's really an answer for that one right now, unfortunately, except I agree with Koshin, and I wanted to tell you a quick story that I will share with my students that I really love. But in the story, a woman has lost her son, and she goes to the Buddha and she says, I would like to not have this suffering and this grief anymore. And the Buddha says, well, if you can find a household that has no suffering and no grief, and then get me a mustard seed from that household and bring it to me, and then you will have no suffering and grief anymore. So she goes from household to household to household to household, where she realizes gradually along this journey that every household has experienced some kind of suffering and some kind of grief. And she goes back to him and she says, now I understand. And I think that's what we're experiencing. And I really do believe that the entire nation is experiencing collective grief and collective trauma, no matter where you are on the spectrum, whether it's collective trauma from this fear of surveillance and being told what to do, or collective trauma from actually experiencing sickness and death. So I don't believe that the trauma isn't there for anyone. I do, and I think that's the only way we're going to be able to move forward from this, is by acknowledging that all of us have experienced collective trauma, but what that trauma looks like and how we name it is very different. And I think that's where the compassion comes in. We have to be able to acknowledge that. So I don't know if that's much of an answer, but that's all I've got.
No, it's definitely is. There's a great question here that was actually where I wanted to take this conversation towards the close of it. One of the most important things for us to think about and to practice is self-care during these times. And that's a kind of ridiculous thing to talk about almost, when we think about the fact that there are so many people that are suffering, Those of us that are healers and caregivers, it is our job to take care of people, and yet we have to add on this notion of self-care, and how to, but we can't do the others without it. We have two direct healers and clinicians, Koshin as a psychologist and as a spiritual leader, and Rana as being day-to-day healing, and Candi as an academic, but and very busy and juggling students and all kinds of things. What have been some of the self-care practices that you have found that is an essential, and even have heard of from, it doesn't have to be yours. It can be like, well, I haven't found time for it, but my friend has been doing brilliantly with X.
A practice that I started probably at the worst point for me was checking in with sort of an accountability partner. At the end of each week, we each had to tell the other 3 ways that we had been kind to ourselves that week, and 3 ways maybe we hadn't been kind to our bodies or our spirit. We had to apologize to ourselves, to release what we had done, and then set an intention for the coming week. And it was such a small thing, it was 5 minutes on a Sunday night of us texting each other. I had wine on Tuesday when I said I wasn't drinking on Tuesdays, and whatever it was in that moment, or I made space to do my yoga practice, even though it felt ridiculous to do yoga during a pandemic. That accountability and intention setting really did help me to move towards a healthier place, where I probably would have just kept evolving.
Yeah, it's a great practice. Koshin, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'm really not into self-care, so that's my main thought. Because I feel like actually when I talk to clinicians around, US and Japan and different.
Oh no, we might be losing you again. All right.
Places we teach is that people are usually like, "Oh, I should do it." Hold on. How is that? Is that better?
Better.
Okay. So I just keep hearing that, it's just like another problem. It's another thing people have to do is their self-care. And so what we've been talking about is kind of a non-dual approach to care, which is not about self-care and then I'm caring for you, because most people who are, in this line of work or service is really like we're interested in giving and receiving. So kind of going back to generosity and realizing the depth of how we care for ourselves is the care we're giving to other people. So it's not about my self-care and what I'm doing for you or what have I done for you lately, but it's like really learning how to, yes, I need to nourish my body, my mind. I need to have good friends. I need to have community. I need to reach out and rest and go for a swim or whatever that is, so that when I'm with you, I can be like, wow, look at you. And I've nourished myself and I can bring that nourishment to you, instead of what many people, the whole word caregiver, I think is a problem. I'm a caregiver, like that's like, and then you have to do the self-care. So I always like the term care partner. Are you being a good care partner to yourself and to the people you're partnering with? Or are you being a little, as my grandmother would say, a little mashugana and like a little scrambled up where you're not really in balance? So those are my thoughts.
I think you're going to start the non-dual revolution.
Perhaps.
You heard it here first, people. The beginning of non-dualistic care. I mean, it's probably pretty old. But Candi, do you have thoughts? And then also, wondering if you just take, we don't have a lot of time left, but a couple minutes to maybe dispel some grief, theories, to give us just like a look into what it means. What is modern theory around grief? I know that is a big ask with only 6 minutes left, but we do have this great question: how can clinical leaders model healthy grieving for their teams and direct care professionals?
Sure. So I would say I love Koshin's care partnering distinction. And I would say my form of self-care has been to find something every day that delights me. And it's amazing. Like I don't know whether I've just not been paying attention for the last like 10 years, but autumn this year has delighted me with its beauty and its vibrancy and its color. And I guess for me, it's important to find something that delights me because that's where life is. And it helps me get through the death, and to really see life and to appreciate its beauty. And like Rana was talking about the art. But in terms of grief theory, I might bore you here for a minute, but I really am a big proponent of continuing bonds and this notion of moving away from stage-based grief theories. So one of the wonderful things about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is she absolutely gave us the opportunity to talk about death and dying, and she really put it front and center stage. The problem, though, is that it became very stage-based, and people were quite critical of themselves if they weren't working through the stages that they thought they had to work through. And this led to feelings of inadequacy and guilt and concern and worry. And so really, grief is an oscillating process where one day you're okay, the next day you're not, or you can be okay and not okay in the same day, several times. So I think I really love the notion of continuing bonds theory, though, because it allows us to reinsert the dead into the realm of the living. And we're not so concerned with getting over our grief, but rather we embrace the idea that our grief comes from the very fact that we love someone so much. And our grief comes from the fact that we have become attached to a certain way of living and a certain way of experiencing the world around us. And it's precisely that discomfort then that makes that space for grief. So in other words, I think grief can teach us a lot about life and love. And if we can move away from those stage-based series, we can also move away from the feelings of guilt and anxiety that also surround those stages. All right, that was quick as I could be.
No, you got it. And I think it's so essential for people to have these models to look to. And I think it really falls in line with Koshin's new revolution around non-dualistic care. Dr. Awdish, Koshin, any thoughts on how we can model healthy grieving in closing?
I know in my immediate circles, I really do try to authentically bring my whole person. And there are many patients that we lose, that we grieve with the families. I think that had really not been permitted in medicine for a long time, but it's part of the care continuum. And doing that is healing for us. We can't separate it.
Yeah, such an important reminder. Koshin?
We just have to show up to what is real, to whatever is in our heart, to the best of our ability. And we're not in charge of what will happen, but like just to say, I'm here, I can listen, I can pause, even if I want to run from all the things I'm feeling. I can learn how to feel my feelings without becoming my feelings. So, and to me, that is the path of courage, which is, means just full of heart. And so to me, it's been an amazing journey so far. And I feel like we're just on a path of 99 curves where we just have to walk one half step at a time, slowly, slowly. and with as much love and tenderness and rigor as we can muster. So.
Beautiful. And this was my hope for this talk, is that we could leave our attendees with some kind of survival kit of tools and ideas and practices and perspective change. And I think we've, because of the three of you, certainly have done that. So thank you. And thank you everyone who took the time today. And here's Beth.
I love that. Thank you so much. I know I'm not the only one who loved that. And I've taken away just so much. I've been sort of taking notes for myself because I don't trust myself to remember it. But just, I really appreciated just accepting, naming, acknowledging the depth of what we're feeling and not emphasizing resilience all the time. It's so difficult. The whole notion of non-dualistic care partnering. I can bring my nourished self to you. I love your practice of accountability, Rana, and release of self-blame with a partner, Candi, finding that which delights you, making small rituals for yourself and your loved ones. This is just fantastic. I'm so grateful to you all. And I'm sure the audience is echoing that. I can see it. They're echoing it, from around the world. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I hate to leave you all, but I have to wrap this up, and I'll just say what we are told to say, which is keep an eye on your email and our website for news of upcoming webinars and events. And we'll send you a brief survey after this closes. So if you can complete it, we'll appreciate your feedback. So thank you all so very, very, very much. Rana, Candi, Michael, Koshin, oh my goodness, powerful. Much appreciated and much love to all of you. And thank you all for being here with us, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.